Women in Public Service project, as many of you know, was launched by Secretary Hillary Clinton to inspire a new generation of women leaders to serve their communities and their countries. And the idea behind that was the mission, the goal of 50 by 50, 50% women in all public service positions and offices by the year 2050. There's no one who personifies and embodies women's leadership and the power, the transformative power of mentoring a new generation of women, as well as inspiring a new body of law and jurisprudence that can transform women's lives and global women's leadership than Additional Solicitor General Indira Jaising. I am not exaggerating when I say that Indira has left a mark on every chapter of Indian jurisprudence concerning gender equality and lawmaking in the last 50 years. I'm not overstating when I say that she has, brick by brick, step by step, dismantled the barriers that have kept women out of public service, leadership, and their right to life. Starting with the Olga Tellis case, the landmark paradigmatic case that held that the right to life would be futile unless women's right to employment and livelihood was seen to be part of the right to life jurisprudence, was something that Indira conceptualized in the lab that she created called the Lawyers Collective. You have to visit the Lawyers Collective to understand what an incubator, what a crucible it is for lawmaking, as well as inspiring a new generation of women lawyers who can be the next warriors for justice. Indira has fought many battles before the Indian Supreme Court and the High Courts of India. But one thing that she told me on my first visit to her, maybe perhaps over 10 years ago, was that she told me, Rangita, every time I enter a court, I see it as a temple of justice. And as a young lawyer at that time, I had goose flesh, just goosebumps, thinking of a woman who for 50 years fought every judge in India, who fought every prosecutor, every public defender, every conformist, but who enters the court thinking of it as a temple of justice. And she has said to those detractors, the promise of the law is anything but indeterminate. I see my job as to redeem the promise of the law and the promise of justice. And recently, she said, in response to Nirbhaya's horrific death, Nirbhaya said, I want to live. She said, I do not want to die of shame. She changed the way society looks at rape from blaming the victim to focusing on the rapist. Indira was one of the first to give an opening statement before the Verma Commission. Chief Justice Verma, another advocate and crusader for justice, legendary crusader who was appointed just before his untimely death to head a commission that would have lasting impact on generations to come. Lasting impact on the history of India as well as the history of South Asia and the world. Indira Jaising spoke before the Verma Commission in defining and informing and shaping the law and guidelines that are to follow post-Nirbhaya. And today what I would like Indira to do is to tell us the story of Nirbhaya. Nirbhaya's life and Nirbhaya's death is not in vain if what can follow can shape the lives of generations to come, as well as can have enormous import on the post-2015 development goals. We want to look at how the prism of Nirbhaya's case and the aftermath of Nirbhaya's case can shape the post-2015 development goals, especially as the UN Women has made recommendations for 3 major cornerstones. The structural impact of gender equality, being violence against women, as being an indicator to a development goal. Secondly, the importance of women's capabilities, building on Amartya Sen and Mata Nussbaum's own important critical work on capabilities theories. And thirdly, the importance of women's leadership, both in the public sector and the private sector, which brings it back so clearly home to us here at the Global Women's Leadership Initiative and the Women in Public Service Project, envisioned by Secretary Hillary Clinton to inspire a new generation of women leaders to address those structural issues of inequality around the world. So I want Indira today to speak of the aftermath of the Nirbhaya case in India, but the impact that it can have on the region as well as on the world. But I also want to make use of this afternoon for her to take us on a journey, her own journey to leadership. As the first woman Solicitor General of India, the first senior counsel to be admitted to the Bombay Supreme Court, the High Court of Bombay, the first Indian to serve on the Committee on the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. And in my words, the only woman in South Asia who emulates the very same qualities of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Justice Ginsburg, before being appointed as an associate Supreme Court justice, looked at the legal system and step by step, one by one, dismantled the areas, the provisions of the law that discriminated against both men and women. And that's exactly what Indira did. When she saw the ways in which the flight attendants of Air India were discriminated against, she used the Constitution's equal protection provision to strike down the gender discrimination in Air India. She did the same with gender discrimination in the civil service. She also helped to draft laws that impact women. The Anti-Violence Against Women law, which was really a milestone, not just in India, but in South Asia, has Indira's mark, stamp on it. She was the chief architect of that law and continues to shape and mold the jurisprudence of that law. So what I would like to do is to ask her to tell us the story of Nirbhaya, the aftermath of Nirbhaya's horrific death, and the impact it can have on international jurisprudence, but also to look at the framework of her own life and work and how that shaped the current work in India on violence against women. Thank you all for joining us this evening, despite a rather slow week here in Washington, D.C. And I want to thank Indira for honoring us with her visit here, not just as the Additional Solicitor General of India, but today as our Global Fellow. Thank you, Indira.
Thank you, Rangita. First of all, she's given me a very generous, what should I say, very generous words. about me and about my background, which I'm not sure how I feel about it, Rangita, but thank you anyway for your kind words. Um, I am aware that there is a worldwide interest in what happened in India on the 16th of December 2012. Uh, that is the brutalization and rape of a girl who was no more than 23 years of age uh, when she was with her friend waiting at a bus stop to looking for transport to get back home after having been to a movie. It was around 10 p.m., which by any stretch of imagination wouldn't be considered too late, and anybody would have an expectation that the streets of the city would be safe at that point of time. However, what happened was that uh, the two of them saw a white bus stop. They stopped at a bus stop and they saw this white bus stopping in there. And the people in the bus summoned them to enter the bus. And they did because they were looking for transport. And when they entered the bus, they found that they were the only two people over there. And it then turned out that this was not a public transport bus. It was what is known as a private bus. And there were about the driver, his helper, and two other people on the bus. And as soon as they got on, it became quite evident that the people on the bus were intent upon embarking on this horrendous act. Uh, the, uh, the bus had tinted glasses, and this is one of the reasons why, although it was in constant motion, no one was able to look inside the bus. And they kept going past several barriers, but the bus didn't stop anywhere, and therefore, um, any attempts that they made inside the bus to resist were not visible to the outside world. Now, this in itself raises many questions for the administration of the city of Delhi. One of them is, why was a private bus allowed to ply um, and pass itself off as public transport? Secondly, it was against the law to have those black tinted glasses. Why were there black tinted glasses? Thirdly, why was there no regulation of any of these issues on the streets of Delhi? And these issues did get raised after this brutal rape. What happened on the bus was an act of gang rape. And and extreme brutalization of the woman on the bus. Her partner was not brutalized in the same way, was held down so that he was not in a position to help her, but she was the one who faced sexual violence and a lot of brutality. And ultimately, of course, they threw both of them out of the running bus onto the road. And it's only when a passerby 20 minutes later saw the two of them on the street that they summoned the police, and after which she was taken to hospital. Now, you all probably know that this incident led to a huge outrage within the country, the likes of which we have not seen before. And many people have asked the question, how come the issue brought so many people onto the street? And I have, of course, my own analysis of the situation. And if you went to the protest, you would have seen that the one thing that everybody was saying unanimously is, quote unquote, we want justice. You know, you use the word justice. And so it was really interesting to see these people use the word justice on the streets, because it really called into question exactly what is the meaning of justice for women. And my own analysis, of course, was that I think Indian society had reached a stage where they had lost all hope in the justice system. where it took anything up to 15 to 20 years to get a case to come to any form of conclusion. And this issue of the justice system dragging its feet was beginning to affect every single member of society. And they raised the issue up front in their protests. And I remember writing a letter to the Chief Justice of India. You know, everybody was protesting on the streets, and people were holding politicians responsible. People were holding the police responsible in a big way. But I got up and I held the Chief Justice of India responsible. And I said to him, I actually picked up the phone and spoke to him. And I told him, I said, do you hear what is being said on the streets of Delhi? And do you not think that you owe a response to the nation? Should you not come out publicly and answer this question when people are saying we want justice? Of course, on the telephone, he agreed with me. He said, yes, I do understand. And but he said, this is not the right time for it, and I will do it at my own time. But let's leave him aside and let's come back to the protests in the meantime. The government of India was not quick to respond. They saw it as, quote unquote, a law and order problem to begin with. The police were busy trying to justify that what they did was correct, that they were not to blame, and what could they do if some private contractor was plying buses, etc. In other words, everyone was trying to pass the buck onto some other political actor, and nobody was willing to take responsibility to begin with. But the public protest was so intense and prolonged. This was one time when members of the public did not give up their protest until the politicians came out and made a statement that they were willing to look at it and do something about it. And ultimately, the government of India did announce the setting up of the Verma Commission to look into the whole issue of sexual assault against women, focusing particularly on sexual assault. Also, you wanted to know the response. Well, I think the judiciary did get the message, and they decided that they were going to set up what they call fast-track courts. So to look at the issue that I spoke about earlier, that why should it take 20 years for a case to come to any form of conclusion? Also, the rate of judicial attrition has been very high. Conviction rates have not been more than 24%. And therefore, the other issue that was being raised at that time was, why is it that we are not able to successfully prosecute a case of sexual violence? Now, the answer to that is very complex. There's a variety of reasons why sexual violence cases have not been prosecuted successfully. I particularly think that the reason is what we have come to call as institutional bias in institutions which exist in society. In particular, the police force, which is primarily responsible for the prosecution of crime, the investigation of crime. And yes, in India, we don't have a separation between the prosecution and the police. There is no separate director of prosecution. The public prosecutors prosecute. So there are strong institutional biases that exist within institutions such as the police, such as the prosecution, such as the judiciary, basically all law enforcement institutions. Now, I have often noticed that when in law there is a parallel between the way race has been traditionally handled and the way gender has been handled. And both of these, I think, have faced the barriers of institutional bias. I'm aware that in this country, a lot of feminist scholars have made a lot of advances in their thinking by using strategies to advance a feminist agenda, looking at the way race was handled in the courts through the judicial process. and using similar strategies, for example, a reliance on Title IV or Title VII for dealing with issues of sexual harassment, for example. So the question, the issue of institutional bias is present when it comes to marginalized societies, and traditionally women have also fallen into this category of marginalized societies. Marginalized not because of their numbers, but marginalized because of their lack of political clout, their lack of political visibility, their lack of political leadership. This has meant that they fall into the category of marginalized communities as well. And I particularly became aware of the issue of institutional bias when I was looking at the Stephen Lawrence inquiry in the UK, where this young man, again, it was very poignant for me when I was looking at it, that this young man of color who was again killed again at a bus stop when he was waiting at a bus stop for a bus, and he was killed by a gang of white young men. And no investigation was done into his death. It was closed as an accidental death or something for which there was no answer. But the family persisted, and because of the persistence of the family, the Macpherson Commission was appointed, and this commission came to the conclusion that there was institutional bias in the UK against people of color. And they gave a definition of what they meant by institutional bias, and they said practices, behavior, and attitudes towards marginalized communities which result in their being denied due process of law. And of course, this definition can be immediately transplanted when it comes to women, and you find the same institutional biases against women. Now, I know that the Nirbhaya incident has caused ripples worldwide. There was a lot of reporting about this incident in the Western media. But some of us were a bit disturbed about the reporting that we saw in the New York Times and in many of the newspapers in this country. We kind of felt as if the reportage tried to make out as if rape was a particularly Indian phenomenon. And, as if it doesn't happen anywhere else in the world, or as if, other countries have transcended this whole issue of violence against women, which for us was very disturbing, and many of us spoke out against it. And I myself pointed out at one stage that in August of the same year, 2012, there had been a particularly brutal gang rape in Ohio of a young girl by a group of footballers. And that incident was not even reported in the same manner that the incident in India was reported. And I happened to be here in the country, was watching television when the trial was going on. And there was an amazing amount of, at the trial, there was a lot of sympathy for the rapists, for the young boys who had committed this act of rape. And that's where I think the global lessons lie. And I also have read the decision, the opinion of the Inter-American Court, Commission rather, in the case of Jessica Gonzalez, which again was a case where a woman in Colorado faced domestic violence from her husband. She had 3 daughters, and she had a protection order. Now, she kept calling the police constantly for protection for these 3 daughters, and the police turned around and said, well, do what you have to do. We don't have the time to deal with issues like this, the kind of low priority that is given to these kind of issues. And of course, what happened eventually was that the father then killed these 3 daughters. They were found in the back dicky of his car, after which, of course, he was arrested, etc. And the case did go right up to the courts in the United States, and the United States took the view that there was no failure of the state in this matter because she had a protection order at the end of the day. Ultimately, it was taken to the Inter-American Commission, And the Inter-American Commission held that the United States had failed in its due diligence towards this victim, in its duty towards this victim. And here's what they said. All states have a legal obligation to protect women from domestic violence, a problem widely recognized by the international community as a serious human rights violation and an extreme form of discrimination. This is part of the legal obligations to respect and ensure the right not to discriminate and to equal protection of the law. They held that there was a denial of equal protection of the law to this woman who faced domestic violence. This due diligence obligation is a principle which applies to all member states. The state's duty to protect and guarantee the rights of domestic violence victims must also be implemented in practice. So this is the point. I mean, we have a lot of legislation, and post the incident of 2012, we've enacted amazing new laws. But one thing that stands out about these laws, which is different from previous laws and perhaps different from laws in this country, is that these laws address the structural imbalance of power which exists in society between different groups. So, for example, they define things like what is a gang rape. They also define things like what happens when a person in charge of an institution, such as a hospital or such as a shelter home, rapes an inmate. What happens when somebody in a police station rapes a person in his custody? What happens when rape occurs in a jail? And we also have an omnibus open-ended category, which is rape by a person who's in a position of dominance in relation to the person who they're raping, or a person in a fiduciary capacity. So the latter, for example, would include a parental relationship or a guardian. And we were ourselves a bit surprised when we were given the statistics, and when we pointed a finger to the Commissioner of Police in Delhi after this case, he suddenly turned around and said, well, I have to point out to you that the largest number of sexual abuse cases take place within families. Now, of course, the Commissioner of Police was probably trying to use this as an excuse for not intervening, that he didn't want to intervene in family relationships. But the statistics that he provided were intimidating in and of themselves, to know that such a high percentage, he claimed it was 92% of all sexual abuse was happening within families. And so, of course, in 2012, we also enacted a law to deal with child sexual abuse. So what the Commission said is that we have to focus on implementation, and it's not enough for states to enact a piece of legislation and forget about it. This is what happened in the Jessica Gonzalez case, that yes, there was a law and that was the end of the story. But when she approached the police and asked them to implement that law, they said, well, that's not our job. You got an order from the court, and that's as much as we can do for you. And that is coming from institutional bias. That is coming from gender bias. It's coming from bias against women. And that is where the most difficult part of our work is located. The Commission said restraining orders are critical in the guarantee of due diligence obligations in case of domestic violence. They are only effective if they are diligently enforced. And then they said states are under a positive obligation to protect and prevent violations of this right through the creation of conditions that may be required for its protection. Now, I am also aware that post this opinion, the United States has taken quite a few steps under its program known as the STOP program, where a substantial amount of funding has been dedicated precisely for the purpose of implementation of orders. And finally, of course, the court said, extended to offerings Jessica a remedy. She was not offered a remedy for the failure of for investigation into the circumstances of her children's death. these are failures of the state's neglect and omission to protect women from imminent acts of violence. The state also has an obligation to investigate systemic failures to prevent the repetition in the future. States must hold public officials accountable, administratively, disciplinary, and criminally, when they do not act in accordance with the rule of law. So that, I guess that brings us really full circle, and I'm reminded of the March 2013 meeting of the Commission on the Status of Women of the UN. For the first time, they passed a resolution on elimination and prevention of violence against women, where a huge amount of focus of that resolution was on prevention on the one hand and implementation on the other hand. So since I've been asked to say a few words about what has been done at the level of implementation, yes, we in India too, we dedicated a huge amount of funding after this incident to the creation of what we call one-stop crisis centers. We have experimented with these one-stop crisis centers in hospitals very successfully. And we find that where such centers exist, it's possible for women to go through the whole system of prosecution without dropping out, because one of the biggest issues is that women do drop out of prosecution. So there is a huge focus on the creation of one-stop crisis centers. And as I said, budgets have been dedicated to that. I already told you that fast-track courts have been designated, and in Nirbhay's case, about 2 weeks back, there was a conviction of all the accused, and they were given a death sentence. I'd like to just raise a few issues which are contested during the whole process between December of 2012 and today. Certain issues have emerged within the women's movement which are contested. One, the women's movement opposed the death penalty. They were not in agreement with it, but there was a popular demand for the death penalty, and I believe that the government of India succumbed to this popular demand and went ahead and required the death penalty for people who commit aggravated rape. Secondly, the age of consent was raised from 16 to 18. Now, many of us did not agree with this at all because we felt that within that age group there was a voluntary sexual activity which was happening. And to criminalize that voluntary sexual activity would mean that you would have people facing the criminal justice system for no reason whatsoever. And secondly, it would have an impact on women who were seeking maybe an abortion after a sexual assault. It would drive them underground, and it would have severe health consequences for women. So we did actually not agree with that. And thirdly, we also did not agree with a form of mandatory reporting of the crime by medical professionals, because we took the view that there are many survivors of sexual violence who approach a medical professional for health and professional reasons, and they do not necessarily want to walk through the criminal justice system. And if mandatory reporting was put in place for medical professionals, it would certainly have a chilling effect on young girls who are seeking, well, now the mandatory reporting is for adult women as well. So it might have a chilling effect on their access to health services. And for these reasons, we did oppose these changes in the law. But they are there on the table, and we are not quite sure how we are going to deal with these changes. The other issue that we lost out on is we, at the same time, were demanding that marital rape should become an offense. The government of India refused to make marital rape an offense. And of course, the reason was the same reason that they would give you in any part of the world, that the so called peace and harmony of the home would be disrupted if marriage rape was going to be an offense. So these are some of the issues that have come center stage after 12th of December 2012. The judiciary in India has become hyperactive, and I was just talking to Rangita this afternoon and telling her that my observation has been that in periods when the political class is either receding or weak, we find that the judiciary becomes very active. And India has been going through a phase of that kind, where politically there is a certain amount of weakness. There is an election round the corner. There is a kind of crisis of identity within our politicians also. There have been serious allegations of corruptions against of high-ranking officials, and all this has certainly demoralized the functioning of the political establishment. And I have observed that at a time like this, the judges are very willing to step in. So indeed, there are petitions pending in the Supreme Court on all the issues that I have talked to you about, on the age of consent, on whether another issue that came up is what should be the age of juvenile, because one of the persons who was an accused was below the age of 18. And under Indian law, he is a juvenile, and the maximum punishment he can receive is 3 years in prison. So the family, of course, felt very cheated by this, and they said, why should that be? And that led to a whole national debate about why should the age of juvenile be 18, why shouldn't it be less? So all these issues are currently pending before the Supreme Court of India. And just to conclude by saying, as far as the global issues are concerned, I think many of these issues are issues which the world at large is trying to grapple with. And for me and for people in the country, it's been a symbiotic process. We've learned a lot from changes which have taken place in this country, in England, and in other countries. And I hope that they will also learn a lot from what we've been doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Indira. I have a few questions before I turn to the audience. Despite the wealth of information and recommendations made by the 630 pages of the Verma Commission report, a few of the critical recommendations made by the Verma Commission were either avoided or not really realized. And one of them, and you alluded to that, was the violence by the armed forces. You know, that was a critical cornerstone of the Verma Commission report, and I think that has a very direct impact on the global violence against women movement, especially Security Council Resolution 1325 and 1820. And this was a missed opportunity for India to be at the forefront of really taking the lead on violence by the armed forces, as well as to inform the global jurisprudence on that. And I know that you and others of the women's movement, as well as the Verma Committee, felt very strongly about violence by the armed forces, and felt very sad that this was left out. Second, you know, as you made it very clear, the Nirbhaya case, horrific as it was just a lightning rod to, you know, violence that is widespread, not just in India, but around the world. And unfortunately, we have to wait for a Nirbhaya or a Maria de Penha, you know, in Brazil, where this woman was rendered a paraplegic by her husband despite many calls to law enforcement, and finally ended up again going to the Inter-American Court of Justice. And the Maria de Penha law that was passed, to some extent, is considered the most comprehensive law on violence against women in the world. And does embrace, just the way you recommended in India, a mixture of both civil and criminal law remedies. So that while you criminalize violence against women, the law also addresses issues of prevention through the civil remedies, and prevention that involves education of both girls and boys. Because one of the sad issues that was raised in the Nirbhaya case was that these young men on the bus thought that Nirbhaya was easy prey because she was with a boyfriend, and she was with a boyfriend after an evening out on a date with a boyfriend, and that was considered loose behavior by these young men. And in fact, her defender also went on record saying, no self-respecting Indian woman is seen after 6 p.m. with a boyfriend on a public road, on public transportation. So this calls out for education as well as prevention and criminalization. And that is why I think both the Maria de Penha law as well as the law that you helped to promulgate in India calls for education, prevention mechanisms, community consciousness raising. So can you speak to both those aspects that I raised, the one on violence by the armed forces and how it was a missed opportunity for India to speak to issues of not just that were raised by Nirbhaya, but by Security Council Resolution 1325, and the issues of education of both girls and boys?
Yeah. The first issue of violence by the armed forces, and we're not here talking just of violence, we're talking about sexual violence. Yes, the issue has been raised in India repeatedly in the context of the deployment of armed forces in the border regions, in particular in Kashmir, in the northeast. And there were documented case studies of women being sexually abused by the armed forces. Now, the armed forces were, to begin with, in denial and not even willing to admit that such kind of rapes occurred. But when confronted with the evidence, they then turned around and said, we have a court-martial proceeding in place. And any cases reported to us of a rape of any woman by any member of the armed forces, we have the preeminent right to try them by court-martial. So why are you insisting that they should go to the regular criminal courts? And that's how they tried to twist the debate around. And then when we said no, but when a member of the armed forces is raping a person, they're not doing it surely, as a member of the armed force, and because it's no part of their duty. So why should they be tried by court-martial? And then the argument was, I remember myself having a discussion with the Chief of Army Staff on this issue, and he turned around and said, you don't understand, we are dealing with issues of terrorism on our borders. And what we will come across, if we agree to your suggestion, you'll find that women will start making false complaints about rape only to harbor terrorists. Now, of course, you can have no argument against something like that, because the statement that he makes is certainly not backed up with any data or any studies to indicate that this is what is happening. So what we did therefore succeed, and therefore it was really a direct confrontation with the Chief of Army Staff. And the Minister of Defense and the Chief of Army Staff kept throwing the ball, back to each other. And the Minister of Defense would say, I'm ready to do it provided the Chief of Army Staff agrees. And the Chief of Army Staff would say, I'm ready to do it provided the Minister agrees. It's not my business, etc. Because, the armed forces are under civilian control. So finally, what did happen was that there's a provision in the law which required prior sanction to be taken for the prosecution of any public officer for any offense. And what we did manage to do is to get them to remove that need for prior sanction for prosecution for the crime of rape or sexual assault. So I would say that we did make, some advances in that direction. And of course, the argument which worked with them was that we said, well, you yourself are saying that rape is no part of the duty of an armed officer. And if it's not part of the duty of an armed officer, and if the protection for taking prior sanctions is only meant for acts performed in the course of duty, then remove this sanction. And that argument worked, and they removed that sanction. So certain advances were made, giving us the possibility of lodging complaints. The other advance that was made was that we've also seen rape occur in situations of communal violence. And we managed to get that recognized because in 2002 in Gujarat, there's documented history that in the context of the communal violence that occurred, women were also raped. And because of that, we were conscious of that, and we managed to get it put on the table as a crime now in our Indian Penal Code, that there's a special category of sexual assault which occurs when there is a situation of communal violence. On the question of prevention, as you yourself point out, Rangita, the only known method of preventing is sensitization and education. I'm not aware of any other method. And that, again, has to begin with, school. It has to begin with changing curricula. It has to begin with, and of course, it has to begin with capacity building. As I said, it is really the most difficult part because that's where dismantling institutional bias is located. That's what it's about. That's what dismantling institutional bias is about, because it's the institutional bias which stereotypes women as sexual beings, as available, as people who are responsible for their own victimization, as people who asked for the rape. And also, it's like a privilege, to have access to a woman sexually. So that is what prevention is about. How does one undo those stereotypes? And as you rightly point out, it begins with education. And as you know, also globally, the focus is now shifting to working with men and boys. Now, in India, the official government attitude is not to begin with men and boys. Yes, curricular, there are attempts being made, but definitely there's a focus of working with communities. And communities, I take it, would be consisting of multicultural and, across age barriers, and there are efforts to work in that direction.
Thank you. I'm going to now turn it to the audience, and I want to also, in the spirit of the Women in Public Service project, as I said earlier, Indira really personifies women's leadership as well as the mentoring relationships to inspire a new generation of women leaders. But I also want to acknowledge a few in this room who have played a part and a role in the Women in Public Service project as leaders and mentors. Farnaz Ispahani, the former parliamentarian from Pakistan who spoke at the first Women in Public Service project program at Wellesley, and then Catherine, who's also a Wellesley College distinguished alumni, who's here with us today. Thank you very much. And questions from the audience? Yes, Stephanie? Stephanie, yes.
Thank you very, very much.
And will you introduce yourself?
Yes, I am. My name is Stephanie Ortaleva, and people don't usually say I talk too silently. But anyway, my name is Stephanie Ortaleva, and I'm the president of an organization, Women Enabled, which works basically advocating for and with women with disabilities, women and girls with disabilities around the world, and our sister organizations in other countries. Coincident to that mission of my organization, I have a small grant to work in India on violence against women and girls with disabilities. And actually, in a few days, I have a small delegation from India who are my partners on this project coming. But one of the things that my research has disclosed, and my own advocacy to the Justice Verma Committee as an outsider, shows that one of the most dominant of the many forms of rape and sexual violence in India has been violence against women and girls with disabilities, both in institutions and in, indeed, public spaces and the private sphere. And there have been, of late, several cases epitomizing the horrific nature of this violence. A number of young deaf women in a school for the deaf who were sexually assaulted by their teachers and administrators. Another rather young girl who was brutally raped in her local community, and one could obviously go on. There were some really strong recommendations of the Justice Verma Committee with respect to women and girls with disabilities that were not, in fact, included within the new law, although there were some changes. But as you so poignantly point out, it is an institutional prejudice about the competence of women with disabilities, both as witnesses and to speak for ourselves, but also just the whole attitude. There have been those who have said, for example, that a woman with disability should just be happy for any sex she can get at all, which is obviously not an attitude that we would share. So I would just like you to talk a little bit about that and how women with disabilities in India were working with the women's community, which I think is essential. And then just as a factual matter, I would just like to point out that with the U.S. government has not yet responded to the decision of the Inter-American Commission in the Jessica Gonzalez case. And regrettably, funding on Violence Against Women Act was in fact reduced and of course now there is no funding because we don't seem to have a government. So there are many such programs that are facing extreme difficulties and even operating right now. But if you could talk about the India and violence against women with disabilities issues, I'd really appreciate it. And any suggestions that you have for me when I go do my work in India in January, I'd also, of course, appreciate. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, it is an important question, and you were right in saying that when the law was changed post the Verma Committee, the focus was on procedural issues. So, for example, they looked at issues like access, or like an enabling environment, or like having translators to translate for women with disabilities, or like not having them to go to the police station, all of which were procedural in nature. One didn't see anything which was substantive when it came to putting them on the table. But if I were to, make suggestions, as you say, as to what I would consider the way forward, I think the most important thing is that the denial of agency to women of disability is something that has to be recognized and dismantled and taken on board, because there is a tendency to believe that people with disability can't make decisions for themselves, in and of themselves. And there are many laws which reinforce this tendency as well, especially when it comes to the issue of mental disabilities. And the whole issue of, let's say, a person who is supposedly mentally disabled cannot take any decisions for herself without looking at, that there could be gradations in even mental disability is not a category, not an absolute category. There are people who can take decisions even though they may not be mentally, as fit as someone else. But there's no recognition of that in the law. It's just a black and white situation. You know, it's either you are disabled or you're not disabled. And there's no way in which the law looks at giving agency to women yeah, within the paradigm of disability as well. One example, if I may give you that, was the case of a woman who was supposedly disabled mentally and was in a home. A lot of these occur in homes. So one of the way the Verma Committee handled the situation is deal with the crime against women in a home as a separate crime. So whether it's a shelter home, or whether it's a hospital, or whether it's a school, or whether it's a police station, it's a different order of crime. Because of the position of dominance. Now, you may say that when it comes to women with disability, there's a double disability over there. One is you are incarcerated and in the custody of somebody, and secondly, you have a disability. So that double bind is not taken care of by the law, though at one level they have taken care of the dominance within the relationship. So that is one area where I think work needs to be done. So to give you that example of a woman who was in a home, who was raped by the superintendent of the home, and she got pregnant. And the case went to court. I'm sure you're aware of that case as well. The case went to court, and the issue there was the medical professionals were arguing that she should mandatorily undergo an abortion. And apparently, the woman herself said that she wanted to keep the baby. And that issue had to go to court. And in court as well, the medical professionals were insisting that she should not be allowed to carry this baby to full term, supposedly because she was disabled, etc. But on the other hand, there was evidence to show that she herself was very insistent that she should be permitted to carry this baby to full term. And there you have it. I mean, the issue there was her decision, her agency. And this case ultimately went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court took the view that she should be allowed to have, her decision had to be the last word. And that's when the decision of the High Court was undone. But surprisingly, this case didn't get the kind of visibility that it should have got. It didn't lead to the necessary changes in the law. And it just remained like an isolated case, and one doesn't know whether similar cases would come with a similar outcome. And I have dealt with a lot of cases. Right now, by the way, India is thinking of some changes to its mental health law. And we are very concerned about it. Because we have opposed this concept of the way they have defined mental disability, and I think there is something specific in that law also when it comes to women, because we've found that disability is something that has been used as a double-edged sword against women. It's not just something which is used to provide them with extra benefit or access. It's also used to undermine their rights. So, speaking for myself, that I think those are the areas in which we'll have to do a lot of work.
Thank you very much for a very comprehensive presentation, and I must say that it generates a lot of feelings of solidarity. My name is Fawzia Saeed. I'm from Pakistan. I'm a women's rights activist, and I just want to briefly share our experience linked to what you have said. I also want to reinforce one of the conclusions, very important conclusions you have made, is that we have to focus on implement, and we have to be smart about intertwining the implementation into the text of the legislation, or have commissions that do focus on implementations. In Pakistan, we led a movement for about 10 years, and it culminated into legislation for women in the last government. And in about a time period of 3 years, we got 7 laws passed after a gap of about 50 years. And Farah is here, so I'm happy because she was one of those parliamentarians that pushed it too. I want to mention that in sexual harassment, the law that was passed, 2 laws actually passed in 2010, we have included implementation process and some monitoring of the implementation within the text, and that has been helpful. And then our government formed an implementation watch committee, which I was chairing, to ensure systematic implementation. And that has helped also, just like you mentioned the example of the commission. Now first we had it at the national level, and now we have it at the provincial level. So we have an implementation commission on the provincial level, which is overseeing implementation of at least three of these laws. So that is helpful. I also strongly feel that sometimes third world countries or South Asian countries, the incident is propagated more than the process of it. Whereas I think the solidarity needs to be built among these struggles and acquiring of political agency of women in all these countries together, bind them in one network, rather than having an issue or an incident put on a flag and kind of roam around. The struggles need to be highlighted more. So in that way, I think that there is a lot of lesson that we will learn. Afghanistan kind of followed that pattern, and they had an amendment on sexual harassment, and now Maldives is almost ready to pass their bill. So that would be a pretty good networking and solidarity.
Thank you. And in response to that, I was just talking to Indira. The Women in Public Service Project is convening a roundtable of women leaders and emerging women leaders in South Asia to address issues of violence against women in the sub-region, using the case study of Nirbhaya as a starting point for both coming together on shared goals as well as exchanging of strategies that can help to advance those shared goals.
Thank you. You were beautifully modest in accepting Rangita's praise for you, but I have to say the women's movement of India, fighting for so many decades, century really, is such an inspiration to people all around the world. And so I want to express my gratitude for that.
Could you introduce yourself?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm John Coonrod with the Hunger Project. My question has to do with your comment on education as being really the most important key to prevention. And I'm just wondering, from your observation, what has been the impact on transforming popular culture in the wake of this past year's protests and awakening, particularly in the major urban centers of India? Is that starting to shift the portrayal of gender-based violence in popular culture?
Okay. There was debate in the media about the portrayal of women in the media and how that was a contributory factor to sustaining a certain stereotype of women, and efforts were made to approach well-known icons of the entertainment industry to change for example, the products they endorse, to go public on the roles they perform, to in their professional life, to in their entertainment, in their movies, to change the way they interact with women and the way the roles that women assume within the industry, and how they're sustained. So at the level of the debate, it was raised. But if you asked me whether I can see an outcome, I would say no. Again, it did polarize opinion within the industry, within the entertainment industry. And there were women who rose to the occasion and said, yes, we agree that we can't have this kind of subordination of women being portrayed in culture and entertainment. And there were others who said, well, it's our decision, it's my body, it's my autonomy. You know, this whole focus of reducing the issue from a structural issue, they wanted to bring it down to an emotional issue. So there were women like that. But the interesting thing, of course, was that from the women's movement there was protest. And there was a case which went all the way up to the court of a guy by the name of Honey Singh, who in his songs was valorizing rape. And the women went to court and they got an order stopping him from performing in a particular hotel, uh, singing those words where he's valorizing rape. There was a counter argument against that, and there were some women from within the women's movement who said, but then we might be seen as being anti-free speech. So, that familiar argument resurfaces all the time, but I think the dominant trend was a rejection of forms of popular culture that valorized violence against women. There was a lot of discussion about it. There could be more, but I would say, unlike in places like the UK maybe, or in this country, I'm not so familiar. I'm a little more familiar about the fact that in some of these countries, there is a very vibrant counterculture, which does capture the imagination of a lot of youth, which actually critiques, all these stereotypical roles, whether it's of women or whether it's the way race is looked at. That kind of counterculture is, well, maybe it's emerging, but I don't see any, definite icons of that kind of counterculture in India as yet.
Take you, Stephanie, and then Eric. So you. I think in the interest of time, Indira, would you mind if we took 3 questions?
Sure.
And without a pause, and then have you answer.
How is the scandal of that terrible case you described, has that sunk down into homes and schools where parents are much more sensitive about raising certainly boys, but certainly encouraging their daughters to not take this stuff? How has that gone?
Hi, Stephanie Foster. My question is actually a good follow-up to these 2 questions as well. What kind of educational programs or strategies have you seen that have been particularly successful with men and boys, but also with women and girls? Because there's lots of education that needs to go on with women as well, and women can sometimes not be the most helpful to other women on this issue. So I think, just curious what you see that has worked to really try to change some of these norms and institutional biases.
And, okay.
I think you raised your hand.
So my name's Samya, and I'm a sophomore at George Washington University, but I'm also from and live in India, in New Delhi, India. So this hits home. My question is that when this happened, I was back for December break, and you had a lot of people come out and say, like, the president's son came and said that all the women protesting were dented and painted. You had religious leaders coming out and saying that if she had called the rapist brothers, then it wouldn't have happened, or that junk food is the reason why men rape women. And my thing was that I saw leaders from all facets of society come out and say, and not defend the rapist, but blame nearby for what had happened to her. And I saw like a whole breakdown of trust in whether it was the religious leaders, whether it was politicians, whether it was the justice system. And I, as my family and all my friends and everyone, we kind of lost any hope we had for the government and the leaders in civil society to actually voice to represent the voices of the people. And I was wondering that, of course, solutions are, but do you really see anything working? Because I think as an Indian, I feel like I've lost hope in a lot of the things that are supposed to be considered institutions, but are really failing at the moment. So that's just, I would like to know what you thought. So that's fine.
Should I?
Okay.
That
was
sort of
an-
follows up. But what was it about this particular incident, about this particular woman, and the elements of this particular case that coalesced and caused such a huge outrage? Because so many other cases of violence in many countries. So why this case, and what did it say about India today?
So education first, the institutional breakdown, and why Nirbhaya, and why
Okay.
this outrage.
Yeah, well, the questions are really interconnected, all these questions. And so, if I could just take
Speak.
them together, um, the education and has it filtered down? That's the thing. Now, see, it's only in 2009 that India passed a law known as the Right to Primary Education Act. And this law mandates the provision of primary education with a lot of focus on the girl child and between the ages of 6 to 14. So the issue of education, as a right to education has just emerged in that age group very recently in the year 2009. And there has not been too much focus on the content of that education. There is a duty cast on our government to provide that kind of education. But yes, civil, you say you've lost hope in leaders and you've lost hope in institutions. But by the same token, surely your hope in civil society should have gone up, because if there were successes, the successes came from the pressures which came from civil society. It is not easy to resist a president's son who comes and says women are dented and painted, dented and painted. It is not easy to resist a religious leader who says that eating junk food is the cause of violence against women. It is not easy to oppose what we call panchayats. To explain what is the panchayat, the local communities appropriate to themselves the role of the implementing the law. They bypass formal courts and they say that they have the right to dispense justice. And we are dealing with them, through the phenomenon of honor killings. I mean, they believe you find women who marry out of choice being killed. You're familiar with this phenomena. But we've had to deal with all these issues. And the very fact that we managed to get a law which, by any standards, is a fairly progressive law. Yes, I told you we lost in 2 or 3 respects. It's not that we didn't lose. I think it tells you something about what's going on in India today. And it's not just about the failure of institutions. There is a weakening of institutions, yes. But then, if you see that weakening of institutions as an opportunity for you to step in, then you do step in. You do step in there. And I was myself surprised, at the measure of success that women's movement finally did get. I wasn't expecting this measure of success. So on the second issue of education, the debates in India have been of a different order, not on the issue of sexism, unfortunately. We've had huge debates on the issue of communalism. Most of our reforms of education have come in the debate between the Hindu right and the progressives, where textbooks are sought to be changed and rechanged depending on which political party is in power. And whenever the right-wing parties come to power, they make a conscious effort to change the textbooks and introduce, things like your mythology and your so-called ancient history, which is supposedly more progressive than your 21st century ideology. They introduce them in the textbooks. And so many of our battles have been in trying to undo, textbooks at that level. And there have been a few cases which have been raised about sexist literature in textbooks. And recently there was a case of, a public examination system asking questions like, oh, do you think women make better teachers than men? Or, stereotyping women in certain roles. And that did lead to a protest from society. So I would say it's at the level of that it hasn't percolated down into the education system, but there is a lot of protest against visible signs of sexism in educational materials. Then what has worked is there is a lot of public messaging at public expense. So, as you said, some of these laws mandate implementation, some of them also mandate awareness creation within the laws. We have statutes which mandate that the state shall create awareness about the existence of these laws. And one of the biggest ones has been what we call the Prenatal Diagnostics Techniques Acts, where there is a son preference in Eastern societies. And it results in the abortion of the female fetus. So conscious preference for having sons. Now that is where the maximum number of maximum efforts have been put in by governments to kind of build a kind of a educational framework where there is an attempt to show equality between the girl child and the boy child, and why families should not be discriminating at that level. And that messaging has shown some results. And it's very much, these are all very much works in progress.
Can I interrupt you for 1 second? So, I couldn't agree more that this is a manifestation of the whole continuum of the devaluation of the girl child. I've been listening to some of the journalists who have been working with some of the family members, especially the mothers of the rapists. And these mothers have said, I cannot believe that I've raised a devil. They have not been able to reconcile the child that they have raised and the boys or the men who went and did this. And there is this whole debate about these young men, these disaffected young men who are victims of urbanization, who come to Delhi from the villages and they are completely anchorless. And so there is that whole debate too, which plays in. So there is education at that level, then there is this whole other movements that have to do with globalization and urbanization that also play into this.
Yeah. I think that answers your question, that what was so special about this case. And that was it. I mean, if you look at the history of this girl, it was a migrant family who came to the city in search of improving their economic prospects. It was a family that where the father went out of his way to support his daughter, which is not the norm in Indian society. And it was the fact that as this young girl was saying, she's lost hope. But the point is, there is that person called Nirbhay in Indian society, okay? It is an emerging middle class, all right? There is an emerging middle class which has a certain aspiration of being upwardly mobile without necessarily having the means to be upwardly mobile. And it's definitely linked to privatization, globalization, and liberalization. A lot of people have lost jobs. And those who haven't lost jobs find themselves in insecure employment. So they would be on contract. Her father, this girl's father, was working as a loader at the airport for wages on a daily basis, with no job security. So, I mean, look at the combination. There is a combination of migration from the rural to the urban areas. There is a rising graft of expectations. And there is a willingness of the family to fulfill those expectations. They were really looking forward to her qualifying and becoming a doctor. And last but not the least, there was the growing influence of the women's movement, which made this woman, she said, Rangita said it in her introduction, she was ill, she was in hospital, but from hospital she was sending out messages saying, I'm not a victim, I want to survive. Now that was a very critical turning point for the women's movement in India. At least for me it was. I don't know about the women's movement, I can't speak for them, but it made a huge difference to the way I think the public would perceive rape, where you don't blame the victim and you recognize that there are structural factors which leads to this.
Can I just ask a follow-up? The age of consent that was raised in the new law, was that for both genders or just for women?
For in the child sexual abuse law, it is for both genders. So, for all practical purposes, it is both genders.
Farnaz, and sorry, you and then Farnaz. Okay.
Thank you so much, Susan. My name is Rena Greifengar. I work for Population Services International. The majority of our work is in family planning and HIV prevention, so we are really looking at gender-based violence and how it's interlinked with family planning and HIV. And we're about to roll out a program in India, so this is very relevant for us. But I'm particularly concerned about the law that you just spoke about in terms of mandatory reporting of health workers, because the WHO's new clinical guidelines on sexual violence say there should not be mandatory reporting. That's kind of the guidance that we're giving out to our providers in the country. And I'm just wondering, do you think this will be enforced? Are there advocacy efforts underway that a community-based organization like us can be a part of? Because I think it could really have a chilling effect, in your words, on women and girls reporting sexual violence, and could cause a lot more harm than good because of the law enforcement instructions.
Yeah. Well, as I said, in and of itself, it is very undesirable from the point of view of access to health and well-being. On the question whether I think it will be used, I think it will be like anything else. There will be a tendency for medical professionals to ignore it because, it just means more work for them. And it means they have to make repeated trips to court. So there will be a tendency to ignore it, although there will be a lingering fear of the law somewhere. But the point is that if you are fairly upper class and a professional, you know how to dodge the law as well, okay? The danger then is it'll be used in a very selective manner. And it's like, there will be a tangential use of it. So it won't be implemented across the board. My answer to you is that it will not be implemented across the board. And there'll be many people who will just ignore the fact that there's mandatory reporting. In fact, some of the doctors who attended some of our consultations, they said so as much. They said, oh, we know there is mandatory reporting. I've heard law enforcement people also talk like that. Well, everything has to be mandatory reported. That doesn't mean we do it. But at the end of the day, it's there in black and white, and therefore there is a plan to challenge the validity of that provision, but we don't know what will happen.
My question for you is a little different. In Pakistan recently, a year ago, a young girl from Swat, Malala Yousafzai, was shot in the head for seeking an education. Now, where I link that to what you're talking about is violence against women. You're talking primarily about sexual violence, but it's the same kind of thing, which is trying to get control over any young woman who is trying to be free, seek a path of education and of independence. Now, we are seeing this more and more, and I do agree with you very much that this does have to do with globalization, economic downturn, and also Rangita's question, which was very, very, I think, on the nose about the military and in countries which are facing terrorism of kinds. In all these situations, the status of a woman, a young woman, and especially not one, like perhaps Samia, you are a privileged person, obviously. So you have to stop and think about young women in India and in other places, and you can't despair. You have to fight for them. You have to speak for them. You can never give up. That's the number one thing. But so I do agree with you, that is my comment, that whether it's a physical violation or sexually or otherwise is definitely a reaction by men to come back. And we are seeing far more violence in Pakistan today than even 5 years ago. In a city like Karachi, and it's going unreported, and I know through political connections, young women are being picked up, ages between 14 and 16, outside schools, supermarkets, all over defense, like the most expensive areas, raped, and then 2-3 hours later, dumped outside their homes. It's not being reported, not being dealt with, because Karachi today has a huge settler population, as Rangita was talking about, but people from up north, from villages in Punjab, Sindh, and other places who are not used to the city culture of Karachi, just like the city culture of Delhi. So this is a regional issue, and I do agree with my colleague Fawzia Saeed from Pakistan that we have to find ways to work as a region, because a lot of these issues of culture, of textbooks, and all of these things are definitely, we can find ways among ourselves. These are global issues, but we find many commonalities in our region. Thank you. Just a comment.
Do we have any more questions?
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Elizabeth Legrand, and I'm the Domestic Abuse Prevention Coordinator for the World Bank, IMF, and IDB. And my question's a little bit more pointed in that our program is to lend support to our staff and our spouses, not only here in Washington at headquarters, but also in country offices. And of course, we have a large office in New Delhi. So we work with women there, primarily spouses that are needing services. And I was curious about the Women's Commission, because I've seen some changes in the last 5 years, I would say. I know the laws have been changing, but I've been very impressed in working with one particular spouse currently about the level of support that she's getting from the Women's Commission. And I really don't know very much about the family law, particularly with domestic violence, but also family law. And I was just wondering, maybe it's something that we could just talk about a few minutes after, because it may not be appropriate to this audience. Thank you.
Okay. Yes. So I think, oh, sorry.
I'm Kathy Blakesley. I'm from USAID originally and now at the National Academy of Sciences. But I have a question about, what do you think the role of Western women's organizations, Western governments, development agencies should be in relation to the violence against women in other parts of the world?
What is the role of Western governments and Western organizations in addressing violence against women in other parts of the world?
It's a difficult question to answer because, as people in this room have also been saying, the problem has to be tackled by us at the regional level. And although we say, yes, it's a global issue, but surely there's no substitute for us being able to hold our own governments responsible. On the other hand, Western governments have shown a lot of interest in India after this incident of 12. Before this incident, I know that a lot of donor agencies, I can't speak, I don't know about the governments, actually said there's no need to deal with the issue of women in India. I don't know whether it's the same is true for Pakistan, because they said, well, now these are emerging economies, and they're doing very well for themselves. And so there is no need for any kind of assistance of any kind. And it is after the incident of 16 December, a lot of them changed their mind. And then we found that a lot of governments, including a lot of donor agencies, were, again wanting to look at issues of violence against women in this part of the world. So that's why I said, it's a little difficult for me to answer that question, except to say that, again, the only way you can look at it is in a global context. The problems are the same. They've been raised at the level of the United Nations. They've been raised at the level of the Millennium Development Goals. They're raised at the level of multinational organizations like the World Bank, etc. Everyone is the only thing which I think the difference I've seen now is that all these institutions, almost for the first time, are actually talking about violence against women. I haven't seen these hardcore institutions like banks and IMF talk about gender and development, or if they have talked about gender, it is mainly in the context of mainstreaming, but not in the context of violence against women. But one sees that change now. One sees them talk about these issues right now.
Indira, I can best end this evening by quoting you, and I think your words speak to all of us, many of the women leaders who are here today, Farnaz, Kathy, because they resonate, your words resonate with many of the women here today and with the new generation of women. Indira writes, "There was a time a few years ago when I thought that my personal and professional journey were done. I was looking forward to the day I could migrate back to my hometown, Bombay, to enjoy personal time with family and friends, to do all the things I wanted to do, continue my interest in music, travel, and do some bird watching. But it seems I will have to wait a little longer to make my journey back home. My third migration, the first from Pakistan to India, the second from the High Court of Bombay to the Supreme Court, and the third home to myself." So Indira, in the words of Farnaz, you can never give up. Thank you. Thank you for never giving up.